Hello, and welcome to the Black Ponder. I'm your host, Neil Trotter, and today we're going to be talking about some environmentalism. And we're going to be doing that by discussing a modern classic, and that is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Oh, be careful about the glare. There it is. There it is. Yes. Silent Spring is a very influential text. It was definitely one of the contributing factors toward fueling the whole environmentalism movement. It was written back in the day, 1962, when, as a response to chemicals that are being used as pesticides and insecticides in harmful ways. These chemicals were being used indiscriminately, and they were not only destroying the environment, but they were also destroying human beings. My mom tells me the story, which was a very common story back in the day, where there would be trucks that would shoot out pesticides and insecticides just in neighborhoods, and she would, as a little kid, she would just run behind these trucks as they were shooting the chemicals out, and she'd just be getting showered by these chemicals, just playing around, because companies that developed these chemicals were very secretive, didn't want to tell the general public how harmful these chemicals actually were. So the general public didn't know that these kinds of chemicals were in fact very harmful. And it took a long time for the general public to actually realize or take into consideration how harmful these chemicals, pesticides and insecticides really were. And a huge part of that realization, that eventual realization, was Rachel Carson's book. Now, Rachel Carson, a scientist, specifically a scientific writer, did a lot of research, investigative journalism, and she put this book together, and it was a huge hit with the general public. A lot of people read it. It was a bestseller, although she got a lot of negative pushback from corporations and the powers that be. She still got the truth out, and eventually a movement came along that drove new regulations and new policies that limited the use of pesticides and insecticides for agricultural purposes. Now, pesticides and insecticides are still used today, and you can still make a good solid argument that they're overused and that they're still doing a lot of harm to the environment, but nowhere near as bad as it used to be. Like, you know, in America, we don't really see people playing around in chemicals and pesticides anymore, right? The people realize that that does harm to the human body. What this text actually shows is the relationship between the environment and humanity, all right? That they're connected. In fact, human beings are part of the environment, okay? And a lot of times we make this mistake as human beings because of our egos, our hubris, or just greed, the pursuit of profit above anything else. We try and separate human beings from the environment. And so what we think when we do harm to the environment, we're not doing harm to ourselves because we're separate, right? But the reality is, when we hurt the environment, we also hurt ourselves, right? Because we're connected, okay? That's what ecology is. This is why science is very important. And that theme, that message, is why I think this book is really important even today. It resonates well today. Let's read some quotes and we'll talk further about this. To a large extent, the physical form and the habits of the Earth's vegetation and its animal life have been molded by the environment. Considering the whole span of earthly time, the opposite effect in which life actually modifies its surrounding has been relatively slight. Only within the moment of time represented by the present century has one species, man, acquired significant power to alter the nature of his world. And this is talking about how the human species is very unique, because the human species is the only species able to change the environment in such a dramatic way. I talk about this further in another text that I covered in another video called The Sixth Extinction. But humanity is dramatically influencing the environment changing it in many ways, and it is unique, and science is showing this. It's not just a natural cycle that's going on. This is just something new that the earth has never experienced before. And that's important to realize. Here's another quote. Nature has introduced great variety into the landscape, but man has displayed a passion for simplifying it. Thus, he undoes the built-in checks and balances by which nature holds the species within bounds. So when we talk about ecology, what we're talking about is the interconnectedness between different species and different life forms, and how that connection fosters life in general. And when you break these connections, you actually are doing harm, because these connections have developed over millennia, right? If you want to think about the theory of evolution, for example, over vast amounts of time, living creatures have adapted in ways that are complementary to their environment. And living creatures have developed relationships that help each other survive. And as human beings, we tend to forget that. This is the science that's known as ecology. It is also an era dominated by industry. This current era is what Rachel Carson is talking about, in which the right to make a dollar at whatever cost is seldom challenged. Capitalism, to its extreme extent. This is what Rachel Carson is talking about. The public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can do so only when in full possession of the facts. In the words of Jean Rustin, the obligation to endure gives us the right to know. So this quote is important, I think, because it tells you two different things. It tells you how human greed, the pursuit for the dollar above all else, is blocking us from the facts, okay? And this is happening today, right? We're to the point where science is being attacked. Facts themselves are being attacked, all for the pursuit of the dollar. And we're definitely seeing that today, for sure. So humanity has to come to a decision. We have to, what's more important? Profit or truth? Okay, which is more important? This is what humanity is wrestling with right now. So what are these facts? There are the importance of ecology, the importance of science. Here again, we are reminded that in nature, nothing exists alone. To understand more clearly how the pollution of our world is happening, we must now look at another of Earth's basic resources, the soil. So Rachel Carson is, she's focusing in on pesticides and insecticides and how they affect the soil, and how by manipulating the soil in negative ways, you're actually damaging the survivability of the human species. But we can think about this more generally, or in contemporary times, when we talk about environmental issues of today, such as climate change. And we have to understand that, what Rachel Carson is right. In nature, nothing exists alone. Okay, humanity does not exist on its own and does not impact nature without repercussions. We cannot master or control nature, because we are nature. We're part of nature. Humanity doesn't exist outside or separate from nature. We are nature itself. We're connected to nature. So when we try to manipulate, control, master nature, really what we're doing is we're manipulating or controlling ourselves, and we're doing that in negative ways. And that's what needs to be understood. Once humanity as a whole recognizes that human beings can't separate themselves from nature, that we actually are part of nature, then we can actually make positive impacts, some positive changes that will truly help ourselves as a species. Let's talk about some examples of ecology. Is it reasonable to suppose that we can apply a broad spectrum insecticide to kill the burrowing larval stages of a crop-destroying insect, for example, without also killing the good insects whose function may be the essential one of breaking down organic matter? Or can we use a non-specific fungicide without also killing the fungi that inhabit the roots of many trees in a beneficial association that aids the tree in extracting nutrients from the soil? The plain truth is that this critically important subject of the ecology of the soil has been largely neglected, even by scientists, and almost completely ignored by controlmen. So the point of pesticides, right, or insecticides, were to target specific insects that are destroying the objectives of agricultural companies. Like they want to grow massive amounts of a certain crop, but these pests or insects are getting in the way. So they try and just target these certain insects, but they do it in such a massive, broad scale that they also kill insects that are beneficial to the environment, that are actually helping crops grow. And again, it's this ignoring of the connection from one species to another. It's this lack of understanding that if you try and destroy one living organism or impact one living thing or aspect of the environment without also considering another part of the environment, you're going to be in trouble because things are connected, and if you throw something off balance, somebody's going to get hurt, and ultimately it's going to be people, because again, human beings are part of the environment. And we see that today, contemporary times, with climate change. For example, we're constantly emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, not understanding the connection between the CO2 and the environment as a whole, like what it's doing to our oceans, which we don't see because we're not part of the ocean, but ultimately does impact humanity, ourselves, because, for example, people who live on the coast, the weather systems that start in the ocean and push forth and develop even further in habitats of human beings. We can't just affect one aspect of the environment without also taking in consideration how that aspect is connected with other parts of the environment. Everything is connected. A question that is not only scientific but moral. The question is whether any civilization can wage relentless war on life without destroying itself and without losing the right to be called civilized. These insecticides are not selective poisons. They do not single out the one species of which we desire to be rid. Each of them is used for the simple reason that it is a deadly poison. It therefore poisons all life with which it comes in contact. I think this is an important quote to consider. What constitutes as civilized? What makes a society a civilization? Okay, is it its technological advancement? How far technologically a society is? Is that what determines what's civilized? Or is it the knowledge of the connectivity of life? Is that a better definition of what's civilized? What impact does the actions of a society have in the world? Taking that into consideration, is that what makes a society civilized? The understanding that its actions have an impact that affects multiple parts of the environment, multiple people, multiple living creatures, and it all comes back to itself because everything is connected. It's ecological awareness. Really, that's what makes a society civilized, is ecological awareness. Not so much as technological advancement. It is human nature to shrug off what may seem to us a vague threat of future disaster. Men are naturally most impressed by diseases which have obvious manifestations, says a wise physician, Dr. Rene Dubois. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, but a wise physician nonetheless. Yet some of their worst enemies creep on them unobtrusively. And that is human nature. We don't realize the impact of something until it's just obvious in our face, but if something slowly develops, it takes a lot for people to realize what's actually happening and to take action. Or maybe to say that more truthfully, it takes a lot for human beings to actually care. They might actually even realize what's happening, but do they actually care enough to do something about it? It's a not so good aspect of human nature. This is a problem of ecology, of interrelationships, of interdependence. We poison the caddisflies in a stream and the salmon runs dwindle and die. We poison the gnats in a lake and the poison travels from link to link of the food chain, and soon the birds of the lake margins become its victims. We spray our elms and the following springs are silent of robin song, not because we sprayed the robins directly, but because the poison traveled step by step through the now familiar elm leaf earthworm robin cycle. These are matters of record, observable, part of the visible world around us. They reflect the web of life, or death that scientists know as ecology. Again, that's the problem with ecology, and that's why we're struggling so much with the issue of climate change, because the major culprits of climate change, they don't see its impact directly, right? There's definitely an impact, and there's definitely a human impact, a negative human impact. For example, people who live on the world's coast are suffering tremendously. They have to relocate, they're dealing with hurricanes more often than usual. There's all these crazy weather patterns. Countries that aren't equipped to handle major environmental crises like droughts or floods, third world countries, they are suffering the most. But first world countries, the ones that are emitting the most CO2 into the atmosphere, don't realize what's happening because they don't see it firsthand. Many people are like, well, I don't understand the issue, what's going on? I mean, I'm fine, you know, I mean, it's a little hotter, you know, and the weather is a little bit different, but for the most part, I'm cool. But our actions are actually impacting other parts of the world, and they're seeing the impact dramatically. Eventually, that is going to come back to haunt us, which we're seeing now. First world countries are dealing with extreme environmental weather patterns that are outside the average, the scientific average. And it is starting to come back to us. And now, finally, after getting smacked in the face, do we realize, oh, we need to do something about it. And that's a certain part of human nature that we need to recognize and we need to confront and deal with. It's a philosophical issue. We are accustomed to look for the gross and immediately affect and to ignore all else. Unless this appears promptly and in such obvious form that it cannot be ignored, we deny the existence of the hazard. Even research men suffer from the handicap of inadequate methods of detecting the beginnings of injury. The lack of sufficiently delicate methods to detect injury before symptoms appear is one of the great unsolved problems in medicine. So it's important that you gotta understand, even scientific people can at first struggle with this. I talked about that in another video that I made about this text called the structure of scientific revolutions and the issue of paradigm shifts that are part of the enterprise of science. This is when philosophy comes in, right? We have to use science in a meaningful way. We have to be aware that science is not even immune to the follies of human nature. And we have to adjust our scientific methodologies to combat the flaws of human nature and get to the reality or the truth of the situation. But someone will object. I have used deodorant sprays on a lawn many times, but have never had convulsions like the World Health Organization's sprayman. So it hasn't harmed me. Even Rachel Carson talks about that in terms of chemicals. I just mentioned that, where people are like, well, you know, I live in upstate San Francisco and there's not really that much of a difference between the 80s and now. Yeah, because you live in a society or a community where that's well equipped to deal with the issue. People who are living in communities and societies that are not well equipped to deal with what's happening are definitely seeing a change, a dramatic negative change. Here, I continue to quote, "It is not that simple. Despite the absence of sudden and dramatic symptoms, one who handles such materials is unquestionably storing up toxic materials in his body. Storage of the chlorinated hydrocarbons, as we have seen, is cumulative, beginning with the smallest intake. The toxic materials become lodged in all fatty tissues of the body. When the reserves of fat are drawn up, the poison may then strike quickly. A New Zealand medical journal recently provided an example. A man under treatment for obesity suddenly developed symptoms of poisoning. On examination, his fat was found to contain stored dieldrin." That's just the chemical that she's referring to, which had been metabolized as he lost weight. The same thing could happen with loss of weight and illness. And Rachel Carson is just talking about the difficulty of realizing the ecological impact of our actions. Our negative actions to the environment aren't necessarily noticeable immediately to everybody. But just because it's not noticeable immediately doesn't mean that it's not harmful to you, directly you. It might come late, a few years later, but it's gonna come. So we have to realize the importance of science, and we have to use science in a philosophically beneficial way. We have to understand that human beings have flaws. And one of our flaws is our tendency toward ego, hubris, and this pursuit, this greed that we have. And it tricks us, it deceives us. We forget that we're all connected. And when we harm someone else or another person or even another creature like an animal or some sort of plant life, we got to be careful, because that connection that we may have with, that we actually probably most likely do have, will come back and bite us in the ass. Our impact on the environment does have an influence, and we have to recognize that influence, and we have to really study it and take it into consideration and use science to fully understand that impact in our connection with what we're impacting. And this is a really strong issue that we're dealing with today. And I think this book, Silent Spring, is very relevant to that issue that we're still dealing with today. There are a lot of contemporary themes of this book, and I encourage you to read it. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Well, you've been watching The Black Ponder. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.